Again, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Professor Mehrotra, for offering us this time. We would first have Professor Mehrotra talk with our colleague Neha Soni, and probably it will be roughly half an hour, and then we will open up for question and answers. So as you all enter and you are listening to the discussion, I request you all to please keep yourself muted. We request you all to please put your information in the chat box, so that way you can introduce yourself, like your name, where you are, and from which batch you are. And if at all you're more interested, you can put additional information as well. We also request you to please have a question in the chat box. And so Neha or I will then unmute you, and you can ask your question. Mostly we would try to do it once Professor Mehrotra finishes his discussion with Neha. So with that, I have a couple additional information for you all. Many of you have been asking about our website and information. So it's CEPTAlumniamericas.org. It has been recently started, I think sometime in June. And thanks to many of you who have been supporting this discussion for quite a long time. So far, we have 134 of you join CEPT Alumni Association of Americas. And you can see this is the spread of CEPT alumni so far. We would love to invite more of us from 60s, 70s, 80s. And if at all you have known them, please reach out to them, invite them to join us. So far, out of 134, we have, this is the kind of mix from architecture, planning, technology, and design. And we would love to keep on inviting more and more people. So if at all someone wants to join, please use this form. Soon enough, I'll be putting this information in the chat box for you all to join. Last time, people asked us about preferred platforms and socializing and all. So we use LinkedIn as a platform for professional sharing our information. At the same time, we use Facebook for social sharing. So most probably, we would like to stick to these two platforms for social as well as professional discussions. And we request you all to please join our groups from these links. I'll be putting this link soon enough so that you can join these groups and keep communicating with fellow Septians. With this, I would like to hand it over to my colleague and a fellow Septian, Neha Soni. She is from Faculty of Architecture, Urban Design, batch 2004. And again, I would like to thanks Professor Mehrotra for giving us this time. Neha would like to introduce him and get the discussion started. Neha, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vatsal. Thank you all for joining in. We have the pleasure to have Professor Rahul Mehrotra with us today. Professor Mehrotra is one of our distinguished CEPT alumni in Americas. And although he needs no introduction, I have the pleasure to introduce him. Rahul Mehrotra is a professor of urban design and planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's a practicing architect, urban designer, and educator. His firm, RMA Architects, is based in Mumbai and Boston. Professor Mehrotra has a wide range of contributions in the field of architecture, urban design, and planning across academia, research, and practice. Today, Professor Mehrotra will be talking about some of his works with us and will be sharing his journey. Welcome, Professor Rahul Mehrotra. Thank you very much for joining all of us here today at CEPT AAA. We are very happy to have you with us.
No, thanks so much. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure. And I mean, to see many people I haven't seen in many years, so it's fantastic. And some new faces, but being from CEPT, we are all of one family, I suppose. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. All right. So to begin our conversation, we would first like to ask you about your recently published book, Working in Mumbai, that captures your work, which suppose for over 35 years since graduating from CEPT in 1985. Would you please tell us a little bit about your recent book?
Sure. Thanks for asking. And so maybe, do you think I should just sort of maybe share the screen and run you through some samples of the book, and then we could have a discussion. That way people will know roughly what's in the book. Is that okay? Yeah,
Yes,
should I do?
absolutely.
Fine.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen and just share with you. This is absolutely brand new, and that's how when I was telling Neha and Vatsal about this, they suggested maybe a good thing to do would be to share it with the alum. So I will just do that. Um, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it. Please go ahead.
So, this is a book that I just finished. Actually, it was released in the US just about a month, not even a month ago. And we're going to do this in India in February. And I mean, I'm definitely going to start the launch at CEPT. So CEPT will be the first place. We were originally supposed to do this with an exhibition and things, but because of the pandemic, things got delayed. So this has just been released here in the US. And it's a book which captures 30 years of practice, 35 years since I graduated from CEPT. And I started a practice 5 years later. And so this is a kind of recollection or a reflection, so to speak, of those 30 years of practice, starting from my time at CEPT. But it is also structured around a kind of theoretical frame of some kind, which therefore contains about 5 essays that are 12,000 words each. So it's very text heavy, but also very visual, as you can see from the video. And I mean, I think it's a provocation to break away from what are usual monographs. And therefore, I start by saying this is not a monograph in a provocative way, because it is really a theoretical reflection on what 30 years have meant, and what practicing as an architect for 30 years in India at a very interesting time when we started liberalizing our economy to the present has sort of meant. And the way the book is structured is it's sort of 4 or 5 parts. One is, it looks at the architecture of the interior. We all start our practices with little things. So one has tried to even theorize that in some way. And also then look at this sort of binary that we are caught in between the rural and urban. It looks at historic preservation or conservation, as I prefer to refer to it. And it begins to look at other sorts of programs. And then the last essay is a reflection of what the city has sort of meant. And so each section really has a 8 to 12,000 word essay, followed by a portfolio of projects. And these projects, so again, this section has an essay which looks at this binary we are caught between, which I don't believe exists, between the rural and the urban, and what it means building in that kind of context, and how one can actually frame the questions that we should be addressing, and what it means for architecture in urban contexts. Of course, it's different. So these are the portfolios of projects, including apartments and many other typologies. And then the conservation section is the biggest. It's about a 14,000 word essay, which looks at this notion of constructing cultural significance, but it's really about historic preservation, but challenging it more critically in terms of also what is the role of design, where the conservation is not just someone who opposes change, but someone who actually facilitates change and is part of the process of change. As I say, conservation is but one planning instrument that helps any society modulate the rate of change. And so as designers, we're actually at the cutting edge of that question. And so this long essay really tries to look at that. And then there's a portfolio of projects which range from our work in urban conservation to looking at institutional buildings like the Prince of Wales Museum, and then contemporary interventions that have been made in these projects, in these historic grade 1 buildings, and how one sort of brings a contemporary sensibility while building in a grade 1 context, but also some more authentically pure or more conservative conservation strategies in the master plan we made for the Taj Mahal for the ASI, but also setting up methodology meant very much for students too, to outline protocols and procedures that become relevant in our contemporary context. And this last chapter, or second last chapter, which is mediating the local and global, is really about looking at global programs like IT centers and other forms of programs that are not sort of, we can't look at our kind of indigenous repertoire of programs or programmatic spatial arrangements, but how do you root global programs, and how do you localize global programs, and how do you globalize local programs that grow very specifically out of our soil, but how they can resonate messages much more broadly. And so these are, again, there's an essay. We look at corporate buildings. This is one of our first projects in 96. We started designing this as 93, just when we liberalized our economy, when everyone wanted glass stars. But we kind of took a different approach for a machine tool company and created a building around 3 courtyards that ventilates and cools passively, but also involved many artists. This is Manjeet Bawa, many other artists who worked on building elements. This project wasn't published. The clients were very low key. And so might be the first time it's really being published. It was finished in 96. It was one of our earliest projects where we, with artists, took scrap metal from the machine tool company for who we built this headquarters and created this whole range of jalis using scrap metal. And then, of course, these are the local programs. So this is a campus for children from the slums, and it's an education campus. And we sort of restricted ourselves to building with materials that are used commonly in the slums as a way of creating familiarity, but also reconfiguring the materials in a way that kids from the slums, when they grow up, might be able to repair their houses with a different sensibility. And so that became a constraint. And of course, the book ends with a celebration of the library we've done at CEPT, which we're very proud of, and how, this whole approach of treating it as a critical conservation project where one is intervening in a contemporary heritage campus. And therefore, while the program required us to do a 6-story building, we buried 3 floors into the ground so that all the datum lines of the original building that Doshis have designed were maintained. So it was very respectful, but interpreted materials differently without sort of mimicking it. So the building really, goes into the ground by 3 floors and takes light all the way down. So this is what you see here is one of the lowest basements. So it brings in light through skylights and courtyards. And it creates a slippage in section of the different components of the building so that visually you're always looking at the diagonal. And then very much last minute, we were asked to also finish the plaza and add a canteen, which we did. And of course, this has been, a great moment for us and something that we are very proud of. And then the last essay, and I'll finish in a minute, is called Context as Generator of Practice, where one has really reflected on what the city of Mumbai has meant on our practice. I believe the place we practice in informs our sensibilities very deeply. And so here in this section, I've actually tried to make a reflection of, that's why it's called Working in Mumbai, on what the city has meant, and then what are various engagements with the city. I used to run the Urban Design Research Institute, and so the research projects, the lectures, the kinds of conversations, the exhibitions, and also the many publications we produced as a result of these research projects, how that has actually influenced the project, the practice. And then the last section, which is a chronology, is actually a book in itself. It's about 45 pages, where one has tried to take projects, publications, exhibitions, and other involvements and affiliations, committees, government committees, and tried to visually represent an intersection between those. And so therefore one then begins to also in reflection see a correlation between the kinds of books and research and the kinds of projects one was involved with and how they might have informed each other. And sometimes, in this year, for example, it's mainly competitions, and we did the CEPT building, so we were very busy. In other times, there are more books. In other cases, the year is more exhibitions. And so this varies. What you see here under 2017 is a new building we've done for the Ahmedabad University, which just got completed, so we couldn't carry it in the main projects, but it's just another, it's right across about 100 yards from CEPT. And And then some things about the studio. We've actually credited everyone who's ever worked in the studio with their roles, which years they were in, and tried to kind of recapture that. So as I said, while you could imagine it as a monograph, it's really truly a reflection about 30 years, but a reflection which also celebrates failure, celebrates confusions, but also celebrates the work, which is what we should all be doing. And so this is something that I will do at CEPT around February. I've just been in touch with them. And that's when we'll formally release the book in India. Again, because of the pandemic, it's been ready for 6 months, but it can't reach out. In America now, it's available on Amazon. So it's just started in the market in Europe and in America. So that's a brief introduction of the book. Thank you, Vatsala, for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you, Professor Mehrotra. This is just very awesome, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing the details of your book. And it has amazing graphics. It looks very comprehensive. And I think it beautifully captures your breadth of work. And we will provide the link to this book in our chat box to all of the participants here. So you already talked about so many of your projects already, but I think we are curious and we would still like to ask you a few more questions.
Sure.
So I think you have given a very intriguing TED talk on the architectural wonder of impermanent cities at TED 2019 last year. So please share your views on impermanent cities and ephemeral urbanism. Why is it important to think of these concepts?
No, that's a complicated question, meaning it could take me forever. Maybe it's better people see my 12-minute TED talk. It'll be probably more lucid. But no, I think, it's interesting and it's an important question. It was interesting for me. I grew up in Mumbai. I, was educated there before I went to Ahmedabad. And of course, studying in Ahmedabad and at CEPT particularly, one was provided with many other lenses in terms of seeing the city and seeing the world and people one learned from. And I think I always came back I actually graduated, and literally the week of graduation, I came to the US to study and do urban design. So I really engaged with Mumbai after studying with CEPT and spending 3 years in Boston and then going back to Mumbai. And when I got to Mumbai, the first couple of years were very confusing because nothing had provided me with looking at Mumbai as a city where informality, where what I call the kinetic city, which was much more prominent than the static city. And I began to very much and very strongly feel that if we assumed, or if we looked at architecture as the only instrument that with which you can deploy urban design, but also architecture as the only spectacle of the city, I think we would have no agency, because our culture, the form of the city, the nature of flux the city was in, the transition, the notion of incomplete urbanization, which is a better way to describe Indian cities, was not what I had been prepared for. And so I began to kind of write about it, and I did an essay many years later, which I captured some of this, called The Kinetic City, where I basically argued that the binary of the formal and the informal was not a productive binary, because in many cases it completely blurred. And therefore we had to find new ways of looking at the city. And the whole idea of or the framing of the essay, which appeared in a book by Andreas Hassan called Urban Imaginaries, was where I tried to explain this idea. And then it was a very interesting story, because I would end my lectures to my students on the kinetic city by provoking them, almost in a way of teasing them, and saying that, look, actually a mega city like this exists, which is the Kumbh Mela, where a city is made only for 55 days. And one day, 2 years before the Kumbh Mela happened, no, actually 1 year before the Kumbh Mela, 2012 Kumbh Mela happened, I decided, oh my God, I should actually go study the Kumbh Mela. And I spoke to Diana Eck, who is in the school of the divinity, the religion school of religion, and she was very excited. And we did a seminar, and we took 40 people 10 faculty and 30 students, and went and lived at the Kumbh Mela for 10 days. And I went several times before that to see how they were planning for it and etc. Anyway, the short story is that it landed up in a book form called Kumbh Mela, Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity. And this is what that TED Talk was based on, because after finishing the book on the Kumbh Mela, we were always, provoked by people to say that, okay, but, how do you expand this? So we did a second book, which is called Ephemeral Urbanism, and it was subtitled, Does Permanence Matter? And it basically tried to develop a taxonomy of impermanence in terms of settlement and occupation. So we looked at transaction, we looked at extraction. So towns for mining, like copper towns in Chile, which we studied, they don't last more than 50 years because the copper in the mine doesn't last more than 50 years. So the time scale is different, but they are ephemeral, but the temporal scale works out in a complete, or is applied in a completely different way. And so we looked at military towns, we looked at settlements for celebration, for religion, for refuge, which is refugee camps, etc. And so it made me kind of think about this notion about, does permanence matter? And the TED Talk that you refer to, just for everybody's reference, was really about asking the question that as architects, do we often make permanent solutions for temporary problems? And so therefore architecture then sometimes becomes the problem, not the solution. And so it's really a much broader plea for two things. One is to embed the notion of the notion of temporality more in our planning and urban design discourse, but also basically question things like the life cycle of materials, and a whole range of issues that open up as a result of asking that question. And so that is really what the provocation is about.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your views. And I think these concepts are, very valuable takeaways for all of us. And, we can definitely use this understanding in our own field of work as well. Thank you so much. My next question is, you are an educator, researcher, and a practitioner. What do you enjoy the most between the practice, research, and academics, and why? And how do you interconnect these three?
Oh my gosh. Well, I would say all three, otherwise I won't be doing them. So I would say absolutely equal. But I think, but I think seriously, I think on another note, I don't even see the difference. And so I think for me, it's all been, I hadn't even imagined I would ever teach. If you asked me in the year 2000, if I would teach, I would think you're crazy. I hadn't planned even, as they say, life is what happens while you're making plans. It wasn't in my plans at all to teach. I studied here for 2 years. I worked for a year with an architect, an African-American architect called David Lee, on a lot of community work, which was very different from what I had studied. But I'm glad I did that, because if I hadn't done that, I would have gone back from America thinking every American carries a backpack, because I never really left the campus. I went back. I had no intentions of staying in the US. I was really raring to go back. I went back to India in '88. And I didn't use my passport for, I think, 10 years till I came for a conference to New York in 1996, 97. So maybe 9 years I didn't. I went to Sri Lanka twice, and I went to visit our friend Rajni Chawla in Bhutan once. But that's the only times I crossed the border of India. So I had no intention of even leaving India. I was so engrossed with everything I was doing and enjoying it, and never taught. But I had been directing the Urban Design Research Institute, which was a form of research and activism and events. And so I suppose one had a taste of academy, but very indirectly. And I met a professor called Douglas Kelbaugh from the University of Michigan, who was visiting CEPT actually on the invitation of Vikram Prakash Aditya, because they were doing a studio at CEPT. And the people from CEPT called me and said, look, if you can't come for the reviews, would you at least show Doug Kelbaugh Mumbai? So I showed him Mumbai. We spent 3 days seeing Mumbai. This was in the year 2000. And at the end of those 3 days, he offered me a position to come and teach for a semester, because he had just received this big Taubman grant and they had a professorship. And so, of course, I said no. But my wife, who had studied at the University of Michigan, was kicking me under the table to say, you have to say yes. So I said, okay, yes. And I went rather reluctantly, I must admit, to teach there. And having spent that semester there, I just can't tell you, it was like a discovery and a joy, because one, suddenly enjoyed it very much. Came back for 2 years. I never even thought about anything till they called me in 2003 and said, would you like to come back to teach? And so then one thing led to the other, and one became much more part of the teaching scene, so to speak. But it wasn't part of my trajectory at all. And so one was, I think, interested in research and writing and discussion, and I don't claim my books to be scholarly in a sense. They really are my own reflections of what I'm interested in at that time. Now, how they connect, I don't know, and that's what this book was, an attempt to do that. And that's why I called it a reflection. And in that last essay, which is a lengthy essay, I've tried to do that, to see. But none of our research has been, and this is something I'm quite insistent on, it's not research. There's, I think, what is very popular now is people say, okay, I'm going to do a housing project, so I'm going to research that typology, and that becomes research. I think that we do that for our projects anyway. In fact, research has to be broader questions that you ask, which you don't even know how they will actually influence your practice. So when I ask the question, does permanence matter? I'm yet building buildings. I don't know how it's going to influence, but it's a question that interests me. And maybe at some point, it'll open up other ways of seeing things. And maybe it has already opened up. And I think I know in some places how it's opened up other ways, but you can never be sure. So research, at least in my view, or for me, is just a form of nourishment. It's a form of curiosity and of asking the questions, but without an intent of what it's going to inform. The moment you do that, you already restrict it, because you sort of answer the question, right? Now, having said that, at least in my own work, there are two kinds of research endeavors, which again, I've tried to describe in the book. One is, I call them instruments of advocacy. So advocacy has taken on a role, and it's also become very popular, and people say we are advocating for X, Y, and Z. Often we assume if we advocate, we make our own research for that advocacy, and we own the research and we own the advocacy. That's a very ungenerous attitude. So sometimes we have to make the instruments for advocacy, which we as architects are trained to do, which other people in the world can take and do things with. So, for example, I've done a book on a walking tour of the fort area in Mumbai. For me, that's an instrument of advocacy. It's something that I know younger architects have taken. They've formed walking tour societies. They use it to, actually they charge you, so they even make money from it. But for me, that's great. But it helps bring awareness about a place, right? And so for me, we've done a book on the Victoria Terminus. We've done a book on the Art Deco buildings of Bombay. For me, these are all instruments of advocacy that they go and they spread awareness, and they have their own life, right? And then there are other books, like the book I've just done on our own work, which is a reflection, which is, not research, but it's a reflection. So it's an introspection. The book on architecture in India since 1990 is, again, just a reflection of having worked in India in 30 years, what was happening around me, and trying to make sense of it. So what one calls research, what one calls reflections, I mean, I think it's more nuanced, and I think that's the way it should be. And if you accept it to be as nuanced as that, then the way it influences you is also more complicated than making a clear equation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but at least it was an attempt. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a very interesting, to learn about your experience and, how you have been, India and coming to US. And I think this leads to my next question. As you have the practice and work in US and India both, please tell us what difference and or similarity do you find between the two?
Actually, I should just redefine that, in the sense I don't have a practice in the US. I've not built in the US. We have a studio here because I'm here. And we have done 2 or 3 or 4 buildings maybe out of India. And so those are the buildings we worked on from here. We did a building in Basel for Novartis on their campus. which was it took 4 or 5 years. It was a lengthy process. So we did that out of here. I mean, it's actually it's a pragmatic choice in the sense that I would love to do work out of here. But the dollar rupee equation, I mean, I can't ask a client in Bombay or Mumbai or India for a dollar fee. And so wherever we've had projects where they've paid us a dollar fee, we could have a small studio here, as you all well understand the cost differences. So we've done a building in Basel for Novartis on their campus, where we worked out of here. And then right on the heels of that project, we were shortlisted as part of 12 architects to do an entry for the competition for the Museum of Modern Art in Sydney. And so they gave us a budget so we could afford to work out of here. We made it to the 4 last finalists. So they gave us another budget that allowed us to work for 1 more year. And, you know, for the last 2-3 years, we've done nothing out of the studio here. It's just there. So it allows us to, but otherwise it's really out of Mumbai and the work is all in India.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your views. So I think we are kind of getting closer to the end of the discussion part. Thank you, Professor Mehrotra, for sharing your amazing story. And it is indeed insightful for all of us to learn from your work, and we greatly appreciate it. And although, you know, one Musings over chai is not even enough to capture the essence of your work, but now we would like to close this part of the discussion and open it up for audience Q&A. And I would like to request everyone to please put your questions in the chat box, and either I or Vatsal can, you know, come to you for your questions.
Sure.
So, is there a question from
Yes,
Parth?
Neha.
Parth Bhavsar?
Go ahead.
Parth,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
Oh, I thought I'm supposed to type it, but yeah, I just wanted to know some interesting story from your time in CEPT. You know, how was CEPT at that time, and or any funny, interesting story. If you want, we can stop the recording and then you can share.
No, no, you don't have to do that. Oh my God, no. I mean, look, if you asked anybody on this audience or on this Hollywood square screen about stories, everyone would have hundreds of stories. Now, gosh, I mean, this is a very hard question. It's a simple question, but a very hard one because, you know, I mean, I don't know. We could have a whole session. But I'm kind of I'm reminded of something, which is, I don't know if it's a story, but it's just an observation because I see Kamar and Jayashri here. You know, my first job was in Kamar Sheikh's office. Kamar had just come back from Paris. And what was very interesting is his brother used to own the cinema theater. Was it Madhuram? Yes? Madhuram, right? Kamar?
Nataraj.
Natraj, sorry. It was Natraj. And what his brother had done was, you know, you had the movie theater and then you had a block on the side, which was toilets on every floor. So one floor, the toilets were removed and Kamar Sheikh was given the space for his office. And I was his first employee sitting there. So,
Toilet below, toilet above.
Yeah, that's right. There was no toilet above. Anyway, and Kamar had just come back. He was busy setting up his house. He was busy starting to teach, and also, I mean, he was just literally back, and the office wasn't so busy at that time, so one had a lot of time to spare. And at that time in Natraj, my favorite film was showing, which was Star Wars, and I had a side entrance to it, so I didn't need to buy a ticket. So every time Kamar would say, today afternoon, there's nothing to do, I would just go and watch Star Wars. So I know Star Wars backwards because I saw it so many times working for Kamar Sheikh. And I think one of the most memorable times in that office was when he got this beautiful painting from Sagra, which was, I think, about 5 feet by 12 feet. And I spent a few days helping him. It was quite an operation installing that large painting, which was on, I think, blockboard, thick blockboard, and installing it in his Jai Shefali house, I remember. But anyway, I just recall that. I don't want to say that's a funny story, but because I just saw them, I thought I should share that with you. But no, I think CEPT at that time, I was there 76. So, there are many people here, Kirti and many others, Sureshba and others who know the early years. But 76 was the time where we were the first batch that did a 5-year program in the architecture. They had just shifted from 6 to 5. So actually there were 2 batches that graduated together. It was yet a very small school. Planning was not even 20 students, and architecture, I think we were 150 people on the campus. So it was incredibly intimate, which means one knew people all the way from the 68 batch to people who were contemporary to you. It was very intimate. And for me, coming from Mumbai and from a big city and all of that, it was remarkable for 2 or 3 reasons. One was, I'll never forget, actually, interesting now that I'm thinking about this, these are memories that are just coming back. My father was a manager for a air conditioning and machine tool company. And he, when I told him I was going to apply to the School of Ahmedabad, Architecture in Ahmedabad, I was 17 years old. He was a bit worried. And so he found an excuse to travel to Ahmedabad on some business thing to go and see the school. And he was very avisual. He had -14 number for his eyes, and he had a detachment. So his eyesight was as bad as you can get. So he was, as a result of it, very avisual. I remember he came back and he sat me down and he said, I know you're very enthusiastic about the school you heard about in Ahmedabad. And I said, yes. And he said, you should think about it. I don't think these guys have their finances together. And I don't want you to go to a school which is so young and it goes bankrupt or something. It's a private trust. So I said, like, what do you mean? And he said, they ran out of money. They haven't even plastered the walls yet. And he said, it's very bad because even the doors they saved on the hinges. They didn't put hinges on the doors because they were all those pivoted doors. And I was completely intrigued by I had no idea what he meant, because not like he bought a photograph and things. And I remember taking the Gujarat Mail, again, the 17-year-old, and I showed up, and it was, I think in June, it had just rained. And from the station, we took a rickshaw and came. I was with somebody else who came with me, also applying. And we showed up at the canteen, and under these neem trees, coming from Bombay, which was like urban, there were a few peacocks dancing around. Harish Bhai's tea was fantastic. It was like, romance. And so luckily one got in and stayed back. But also I think what for me was, and has been very significant impact when I think about it, is then staying in the hostel, and you suddenly were sharing rooms with, meeting, eating with people from across the country, from small towns, from people who, were coming from such diverse cultural backgrounds. It was just like mind blowing. And in retrospect, I think I wouldn't give it up for anything if I had to play it out again. So, yeah.
Right, thank you. This is interesting. All right. We have next question from Ajay Nair. Would you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
You missed out first one for Priyanka said.
Priyanka's must be very academic, so maybe skip it and go to something else so we can talk about lighter. I'm joking. No, what is Priyanka's?
Yeah, sure. Priyanka, please go ahead.
Priyanka.
Hi, Professor Mehrotra. You're right.
Keep it light, Priyanka, no heavy questions.
Rather heavy. But and I was just intrigued by the way you mentioned globalizing the local and localizing the global. And I was wondering if one can extrapolate that to conservation practices. And what is your thought on that?
What do you mean extrapolated to conservation practices?
When we think of conservation, it's very often, at least what we have learned, or my exposure to whatever I've seen in India, is very local. It's at a very local scale. Can you extrapolate that in terms of?
No, I think in the essay, at least, conservation has been treated separately. What I've tried to argue in the local and global is I've built on, my argument that I think with globalization and global capital, we are getting what I call the architecture of impatient capital. It's the architecture we see everywhere, the tyranny of images, where you have these glass-clad boxes that go up in all forms and shapes. They're really vendor-driven buildings where actually architects, however much we might pretend, have a very little role to play. And that's why architects globally are twisting and turning their buildings just to make them unique. But essentially, these are vendor-driven products, right? That's one. They're vendor-driven because time is of essence, because capital is inherently impatient and wants to realize its value. And the terrains which provide less friction for capital to realize its value, like Dubai, Shanghai, all of that is where capital lands. And that's why when we talk about Bombay and we say, we must make it like Shanghai, basically what we are saying is let's make it frictionless so capital will arrive here. And that doesn't happen so easily. Now, from that comes a very particular kind of architecture and a very set of compulsive images that even clients want to drive, which means they then expect, so when we get appointed to a corporate building, and that's why that LMW building I showed you, that's what our client told us. We've got a guy in Australia who's willing to bring in the curtain glazing. This is what we want. We want a 100,000 square foot building. We want a fountain and a garden in the front. We want parking behind. It's a very clean imagination of how capital should be deployed and the images that go with it, and therefore the idea of the tyranny of images. Yeah. So the argument in the essay is really, how do you localize that capital? How do you make that capital feel more invested in the locality and engage with the locality? And how do you reformulate architecture spatially, etc., but also in the way it's actually made, and crafted, more cognizant of the local labor markets, the local procedures in terms of building, the local kind of crafts that exist. And I don't mean crafts in the way of romanticizing it, because then it gets restricted to stone and wood and things that we've imagined traditionally as craft. But even if it's industrial materials, how can they be crafted? Because you need a different deployment of labor. So therefore, what I've argued in that section is really how global capital can be made to feel more invested in a locality and therefore more responsible for that locality, and not because in today's world, a corporate capital moving from one locality to the other, it means 3 executives getting onto a jumbo jet with their laptops and the whole corporation is moved essentially, and so the reverse of that is globalizing local, right? Which is where I've added, globalizing the local, where one has added that we often, when we get very localized and specific programs, like the little campus we were doing for slum children, or we've done a project which is in the thing for elephants and mahouts in Jaipur, or we've done public toilets in the slums. We tend to caricature these, when we build, because we feel by caricaturing them almost in terms of imagery, it's a way of localizing it. And therefore, one has argued that in this sort of globalized and interconnected, networked world, how can one take the lessons of some of those extreme conditions of deploying program like that and formulate them in the way they actually resonate more globally in terms of the lessons the world can learn from them, and why should we be shy of them? Why should we make them so aspirationally local? Because in aspirations now, the global is omnipresent, right? And so therefore, again, it also becomes an argument to dissipate the binary that otherwise is set up between the local and the global. Now, in conservation, I'm not sure how and what that means, and maybe the way I've clarified it now, you might want to restate your own question in the context of conservation. Conservation, those buildings which are rooted and become part of a cultural landscape, often over decades and decades and decades, when you're actually engaging with the practice of conserving them, you begin to, of course, deploy local materials. But I have argued more broadly about, that's why it's titled Constructing Cultural Significance, where one has argued that significance is not static, like identity is not a found category. Identity is something we construct every day. And therefore, the role of the architect as designer in the process of conservation is how one modulates that rate of change, which means how does one reimagine the reconstruction of that significance. And that is a very fine line, because what we are really doing is keeping the illusion of architecture intact, but we are creating new relationships with those objects for that contemporary society. So that becomes the argument in that section.
Right.
Right. I'll probably reach out to you for more, like a longer conversation on that, because I have some thoughts, but I'll reach out to you directly. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Rahul Mehrotra. I think the next question we have is from Jay Mittal.
Hi, Rahul. You are a dream of most academics. In a way, how you climbed up right from graduation from CEPT all the way to GSD Dean. Could you share your journey in like small snippets? The challenges that you faced and the opportunities that you got and you tapped rightly, and any directions for folks who are in academia?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to be very honest, my trajectory is a very non-conventional academic trajectory. And that's why I said, life is what happens while you're making plans. The academy wasn't part of my trajectory at all. And I'm totally honest about that. And so, like I said, now in retrospect, because I was working for the Urban Design Research Institute, I was doing things that involve setting up conferences and lectures and doing research and writing. In a way, in retrospect, one prepared for the academy, but I came to the academy really, much later. I was 40 when I had my first position as first visiting faculty. Then I came as associate professor, but I already had, let's say, about 10 years of building and writing and all of that behind me. And I went to the University of Michigan. I worked there for 3-4 years. And then, I was invited to come to MIT. And then from MIT, I was invited to come as chair to the urban planning department. I don't have a degree in urban planning, but at the design school, they felt that I had been working on urban questions. And they needed another perspective, someone who as a designer would come to urban questions. And so it's a very non-conventional trajectory. So I'm not sure how I can, give you any clues, because I would not suggest you follow that. It was a series of, I would say, not accidents, but there were opportunities that were very particular. I think things just sort of fell into place. So, I mean, that's one way I would explain it. The other way I would sort of say is that, sometimes I think if you just follow your interests and your passions, things sometimes without even you knowing it begin to add up, and somebody else recognizes how it adds up. And so I would say that one just had very good mentors. And so, Doug Kelbaugh, who's retired now, but I really, he sort of later on said to me, because he saw the combination of what things I'd done, that this potential was something that I should be doing. So, I mean, I would think he was an important mentor. And similarly, when I went to MIT, it was a Chinese architect called Young Ho Chang, who was then the chair of the architecture department. And we had worked on a competition together in China, which nothing came of it, but we spent a lot of time working on it together. And he said, look, you should be teaching, and you should be teaching at MIT. So he mentored me to come there. And then, similarly, I came to Harvard, which was a different thing, going back to my alma mater. And it's interesting now, many of the teachers who taught me at Harvard are yet there in the department. And many of them report to me now in a strange way, because I'm chairing the department. So it's an inversal, but they were all the very important mentors who made it possible. So I mean, and that's why I think in a way that one even reflects about research, you can be very conscious about the research you're doing, and you can make the research very opportunistic, where you say, because I'm working on a project for a hospital, I'm going to become an expert and do research on the hospital. And, it can be very mindful and very deliberate, right? The other way you can do research is just ask the questions that you enjoy asking and do it. And so similarly, in all our trajectories, I mean, it's always a combination of what is sometimes the most deliberate things never work out, and the things that you didn't imagine work out very easily. because when you get overly conscious about what you want to achieve, you often make the missteps because you carry the baggage of that consciousness, no? So I don't know. I'm just reflecting back. I think it's I don't know how to explain it, but I think I mean in retrospect, I would just say that really follow your heart more than anything else.
Thank you.
Thank you both. All right. So our next question is from Ajay Nair. Please go ahead. Ajay Nair.
Yeah, Dr. Mehrotra, I think thank you. I think during the COVID season, I had an opportunity to in touch with you, and we had a brief exchange between us. But probably straight to the question, I've been following a lot of things globally. Been working in different countries for the last 25 plus years. What I've been observing is the so-called automated supply chain activities in every segment of the life that is changing the way we consume, the way we build, the way we will be probably living in the future actually. So how does that supply chain of materials affecting the building design and city construction in the future? Then again, that question leads to another thing actually. India typically have a long history of cultural heritage. We carry a lot of burden of maintaining and retaining those cultural heritage. How do you think into the future this materials coming from China? Probably if it is not a war between India and China or the war-like situation, we would be more consuming more goods from China in our industry, AEC industry, and we would be looking 20 years down more like a Chinese city. Bombay would look like a Chinese city actually. So I would like to listen to you. How do you see going forward? What will you build in India actually?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that's like a complicated question, but I mean, there are many ways to answer that. I mean, if I extend what your question is, then I have to assume the floodgates will be completely open and things will go all over the place. But I mean, I think architecture has an important role to play here to show other ways things can be done, to not necessarily pander to that. I think if I was listening to your question 5 or 10 years ago, I would maybe assume that is going to be really the reality. With the events of the last decade, the events of the last year, I don't think it's going to be accelerated in the way your question implies. I think the local is going to have much more value. I think, as I've described it in something I've written recently in Domus, the way we imagine our home and our world has completely changed. And that relationship between our home and the world, and I mean home as locality, more or less, I think we've come to value it much more. I think we'll come to protect it much more. I think we'll come to make it more intrinsic to our imaginations. The world has become virtual. The home has become real. And it had inversed for a while, unfortunately. And so that is, I mean, so, this is an argument we can go back and forth. I don't think anyone could, I don't know, predict it or what form it might take. But, one of the things, again, that I've argued in the book is how do we as architects make our spheres of concern intersect with our spheres of influence? Right now, I think what is also implicit in your question is our sphere of influence is diminishing. And what you're defining is a particular sphere of concern, right? And so often, in the evenings or in a conversation like this, we can talk about materials flowing, we can talk about climate change, we can talk about social injustice, poverty, we can talk about 100 things, and we'll get up in the morning and go back to doing our working drawings for somebody's house. And suddenly you have really no agency in the world in the way we describe our concerns, right? So the question is, how do you begin to collapse those two gaps, And and I think, we all do it in our own small way, and we can do it in bigger ways. And I think that's what we have to hope for and strive for. And having said that, I think the other kind of clue, or the other thought, so to speak, would be that, and again, something one has elaborated as an argument in the book, is this notion of the context of the context. Now, as architects, we have been trained to understand the context. We look at the context as climate, materials available. We look at the context as, the soil condition. Some of us who are more ambitious, we look at the context as embedded histories, right? But that context also sits in another context, which is a context where economy and governance and politics all kind of intersect. And so how does every building we do actually kind of nestle that idea of the context in its context? And I think that that intersection is where I think one can derive a lot of clues in the kinds of decisions we make and choices we make, and how, whether we deploy material, even going back to Priyanka's question. I mean, although that was specific in conservation, and I'm not sure I answered it or even understood it, but it can go to many aspects of deployment, even spatial deployment, in the way you say dissipate borders between economic groups that occupy a building. So there are just many parameters we can be more ambitious about if we begin to create those kinds of intersections in our own understanding of what the project is. I also argue in the book, for example, which is something that, and I think there's an interesting question from Chandani, which I'd like to go to at the end, and maybe this will lead me to Chandani's question, which is that, doing CEPT, actually doing the CEPT libraries, when it was like a eureka moment for me, and it made me understand that the way we look at clients is very singular. We say, I have a client and CEPT is my client. Or we did this project for Hatigao, where the state government was our client. The chief minister of Rajasthan actually was our client. It was a competition. And I struggled with that project over 10 or 12 years. And it was even more difficult than CEPT, and CEPT was very difficult, and I'll tell you why. But I then began to question, what is the client? And I realized actually the way we pick up the client is inaccurate. And a client is, you have to differentiate and nuance a client, right? So for me, a client is broadly three things, or three entities. A client is a patron client, a client is an operational client, and a client is a user client. And these are actually differentiated entities, often with differentiated aspirations. Yeah? So often, so like if you're designing a campus, so like let's say we were designing low-cost housing for the chief minister. So the chief minister of Rajasthan, in this case Vasundhara Raje, was our patron client, right? Our operational client was the PWD for 1 year, then they changed it to the RTDC, then they changed it to the Forest Department, then they changed it to the Amber Development Authority, then they changed it back to the Tourism Department. So they were operational clients that were moving around, but let's say it's the PWD, right? And the user clients in this case were, 100 elephants and their mahouts and their families. Now, what's interesting is that they had no interconnection with each other at all. The PWD engineers were scared to approach the chief minister. We had to set up the meetings so they could talk to the chief minister. The mahouts and the elephants were, looked down very badly by the PWD engineers, who were really essentially all male and all very chauvinist. And so they gave them no chance or voice. And the chief minister she would not go and come and meet the mahouts, right? And that's not likely to happen except when the project was inaugurated or if the foundation stone was laid. So we found we were actually playing the role of mediating, like bridges between these three constituent groups, which are all the clients, right? And so therefore I understood from that project that if an architect can actually bring and recognize the aspirations of that differentiated set of groups on the same plane, then you'll get a project that is meaningful, right? Now, in a single family house, which is our dream projects, we all publish our single family houses because they turn out to be perfect. That entity collapses into one. I mean, the only difference is it could be a couple who don't get along and you become a psychotherapist. But besides that, it becomes one entity because the operational client, the user client, and the patron client is one. And that's why in a single family house, I believe the frictions are very little. It could happen in other projects too, where the patron client is very operational, but a single family house is where that happens. In CEPT, let's take CEPT, for example. And Chandni, after this, I'll go to your question. In CEPT, who are the patron clients are the Ahmedabad Education Society, right? The operational clients is the campus committee and the campus architects and the president of CEPT and all of that. The president of CEPT, you could argue, is 1 foot in the patron client and 1 foot in the operational client. And the users are the students, right? And so for me, it was really a matter of then negotiating. And so we did many public presentations with the students. I talked to a lot of students. I'm not saying that resulted in the perfect building by any means. I mean, people might have many differences of the building. Let's accept that. But it allowed me to begin to at least navigate between these. And the Ahmedabad Education Society, I luckily happened to be doing another project for people who are in the Ahmedabad Education Society, which gave me access also to the Ahmedabad Education Society, which in all honesty, sometimes Bimal Patel would also tell me, look, why don't you go talk to them because you know them and, you know, present this. So I was kind of playing all these roles and actually connecting between these three constituencies. Again, this is only clear in reflection. While I was doing it, I was just doing it to save the project or to get a little more budget, or if someone didn't agree with the decision, try to get the other people to reverse it, you know, etc. Just playing the politics of any usual project. But in writing this book and reflecting about it, I think for me now that has become a very important way of understanding the projects. And the last few projects we've been engaged with in understanding that, it has allowed me to see things quite differently. So then with that, I'm going to go to Chandani Patwa's question. If time permits, you may have been asked many times, what were some of the challenges designing for CEPT campus? Where you have the most unusual clients at a campus full of designers, engineers, planners, where everyone has a critique, very much loves the campus. Oh my God, I can't tell you how, my gosh, that is a very good question. It was the most difficult project of my lifetime. It was difficult for 2 or 3 or 4 reasons. One was it was very difficult to step into a situation which was incredibly already polarized just because of the change of guard between the old and the new guard. There was a camp that was very much, you know, I mean, yeah, there was, you know, okay, let me say there was a Doshi camp and there was another camp that was all the, you know, new people who were running the school. So there was a lot of polarization and there was, you know, just a lot of heartburn. And, you know, from that, the very difficult narrative to deal with was that, you know, it was going to be well, I mean, there have been other buildings on the campus, but recently a building designed by someone else on the campus. So that was, I mean, a very difficult atmosphere to come into. Also because, you know, I mean, I was getting calls from Doshi not to do it. I was getting calls from people, you should do it, you know, so it was like, one had to very deeply introspect to decide on taking it on or not. The second difficulty was really that the master plan had already been done. So we had no say in where to place the building. And the program for the building would have required a 6-story building for the library. So that was like, I mean, I decided that like wasn't not going to be something I would do. And so that was very difficult. And then the third difficulty was, as your question said, the committee was not only all architects, but the committee was all architects who had also ragged me when I had come in as a junior, right? So they were all my seniors who, like, you know, like already, I mean, from the first day were looking down at me, but in a very nice way. I mean, they were very, very supportive. I don't mean it in a negative way, but it was intimidating because these were the same people who, you know, you had looked up to in great respect, and therefore everything they said meant a lot, which means that one got huge amounts of inputs, which, you know, one had to assimilate, one couldn't take lightly, right? I mean, where do you have a client when you present the project to them? You know, how do clients usually respond? Either the cost is too high, or make that door bigger. I want my main door to look bigger, or make the storeroom bigger, or, you know, there'll be things like that, or what materials. But here I'd have clients who I would present to, and there would be silence for 5 or 10 minutes. And then someone would say, Rahul, I completely disagree with the attitude you've taken in the way the building touches the ground. Now that then you have to, sit back, because then, and then they would quote history and they would say, I feel there's a kind of Baroque edge to this, or there's something. And I'm like, it was a whole different conversation. So while you're in the same meeting trying to figure out costs, you're also trying to discuss your attitude to how the building touches the ground. So I hadn't experienced those diametrically opposite sets of things to resolve in one meeting. So it was complicated for that. And then we made it complicated for ourselves by doing a building that goes 3 floors into the ground, which was not only a construction challenge, it was a challenge to convince everyone, it was a challenge to engineer it. Not that it was more expensive, but it was just a big risk, which was overwhelmingly high. And therefore, a combination of all of that just made it very difficult.
Thank you very much, sir. I just feel privileged that I got a chance to actually ask you this question.
Sure.
I'm from a 92 batch in architecture, so I've seen my seniors go to work for you, do internships. Later on in the years, I've had a chance to see a house designed by you in Ahmedabad, the orchard house, or the mango orchard, family friends. So when I heard that you were working on the campus, the first time the renovations happened, I was like, I would be terrified. So,
I was terrified.
It's like being in classroom all over again, your designs being critiqued in all this cryptic language, sometimes passive aggressive and sometimes direct, while you're actually trying to build, like you said, with, cost, constructibility, sensitivity. You can't call it historic, but historic preservation, all of that. So I appreciate.
Actually, Chandni, you should have answered the question for me. You're doing a better job. But but I'll say one thing now that you've brought this up. I mean, that was one of the big challenges. I mean, of course, cost was a big challenge, and there was a lot of pressure to do the buildings using the same vocabulary of the older buildings in brick and concrete. In fact, and someday I've saved all these in my archives, the amount of options we studied. And then finally, I think in my mind, at least, and in my mind, the resolution was really finally that this generation of architects, I mean, including from the time you studied, are going out into the world and they're confronting. And I go back to I think, was it Raj Iyer? No, I forget who's the
Jay
last.
Nair. Ajay Nair.
Yeah. His question about materials. So it was really about also saying how one can respect the older buildings by maintaining all the datums and the heights and the proportions, also the concrete in a base, but using the concrete in a different way, but also deploying a whole range of new materials and showing ways those new materials could be adapted, from plywood to gypsum board to glass to steel. So therefore, then finally, we took the attitude that, look, let's make it a vocabulary of materials. We've also developed a handbook in Gujarati and in English, which is a handbook. It's a 20-page handbook, which shows how for different season, for different times of the day, for different months, how the louvers should ideally be fixed, because each louver has 6 fittings, has 6 fixing positions. And so we've kind of done that almost in a way. Unfortunately, it's not been used like that, and I hope someday someone will. But one had also thought of it as a teaching tool of how people could measure temperature. If a building goes 3 floors below the ground, what would those readings be? So could passive cooling be taught through the building? Maybe it doesn't work, maybe it works, maybe that's itself a lesson. And similarly, how the facade can be set for literally for every month through the year in ideal situations for each side of the building. So we actually did a lot of that. We did a lot of drawings. We made a 200-page portfolio of every working drawing, which is in the CEPT library. We've given it to them for reference to students. So we began to then also see it as something that could be a learning tool.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I mean, it opens it up to a lot of criticism, so it makes it more susceptible, but we felt it was worth it.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you both for an interesting conversation. I think we are way above 1 hour. So if and we are an enthused crowd, the questions are flooding in. So Rahul Mehrotra, if it is okay with you, we can go ahead, or we could wrap it up because
Oh,
it's
anything to do with CEPT, I can keep going.
perfect. All right. So all right, I'll go ahead.
I'd just like to add one thing. Rahul, it was a very interesting journey of yours. And I think many went through the similar situation, especially the relation with the client is the most challenging, and nothing been talked about it when we study this. But very inspiring, very thoughtful, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh. I want to just go, if you don't mind, to Jinraj's question, because I think that's a very good question. Jinraj Joshipura asks, Victoria Terminal and Bombay Fort areas more documents, so what is the advocacy in it? So Jinraj, no, that's, I think, a very good question. So I'll just give you my story on it, which is again described in detail in the book. So, having gone back from the GSD studying urban design, when I went back to Mumbai, there were many groups, the Indian Heritage Society, INTAC, who had been listing buildings. And they had a list of 700 buildings which they wanted to preserve. And I began to help them write up, notes on the buildings so that we could justify why they were important historically. In the process of doing all of that, I realized that this was going to be a losing battle, that unless you moved the debate to urban conservation, you could not write legislation. And there was no point saving a building if next to it another high-rise building appeared. So urban form was very important in conservation, as it would be in the pole area, as it would be in any historic district. And so we organized workshops, and we did a workshop called Conserving an Image Center, which resulted in a very successful set of conversations. And we followed it up with a document, which we submitted to the government. And in 1995, it became legislation. It was actually the first legislation in India for urban conservation. We came and did workshops in Ahmedabad with Bimal and with other people. I brought Sham Chainani with me. That's what led then to the Ahmedabad legislation, because then Hyderabad, SP Shori had been doing it before Mumbai, and he wrote a very famous article called The Hare and the Tortoise, where he said how Bombay had managed to get it first. Now, as part of that process, advocacy was important, because once we had the legislation, nothing happened on the ground. And then we began to ask the question is, how do we advocate for now using the legislation effectively? And so whether it was walking tours of the fort area to bring people to walk around and see it, the Victoria terminus led to it being declared a World Heritage Site. These became very important to bring attention even within the city to these areas. We followed that up with doing the Kala Ghoda Festival. That was a festival that was organized to raise money to restore the Elphinstone College, to restore the plaza there, to restore buildings around. So these became, that's why I call them instruments for advocacy. They became instruments in two ways. They began to actually create awareness, which means it allowed other people to get the knowledge to fight for the same causes, which otherwise we tend to keep in our own head. So it became a form of sharing. But it also became a form of us having a credible voice. You see, I think in society, what has happened is architects have lost their credibility as a voice. And that only comes by us establishing expertise. And the expertise comes by us communicating these things. And therefore, I think these forums become important in the way we can build constituencies, like perhaps politicians build constituencies. So I call them instruments of advocacy from that perspective, and you have to contextualize it in that frame to understand why they were instruments of advocacy.
Right. Jinraj Joshi, I think you are on mute. Would you like to say something? Yes, we can hear you now.
Rahul, where are you? No.
I'm right here.
No, I can. Okay, I was not being critical. I was asking you what were those instruments of advocacy, because every time I was born in Bombay, I lived in Bombay, and I go to Flora Fountain and I see those historic buildings, that library of Cecil Bidoun and all that. I love the fort area.
Yeah.
So I also took a walking tour of one of the architects, which Akhtar Chavan introduced me, and I was very happy because some of the buildings did not know the history of it.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy that what has happened and what instrument of advocacy you are talking about has been implemented. And every time I walk more and more streets in Bombay, I find more and more historic buildings everywhere, small, which were not preserved. They are degraded. And I often feel, oh, let me buy this whole building and restore it. Like the Premabai Hall. Not Premabai Hall, sorry. Our Opera House has been restored.
Yeah.
Bombay, near where I live.
If you go into the fort area now, say for example, if you went back to Flora Fountain now, not only has the fountain been restored, but all the hoardings in the entire Flora Fountain area have been removed. So all those buildings.
Excellent. Yes.
So, and I think this comes slowly, but it comes from awareness. Now, whether a lot of the buildings are caught in rent control, they're caught in tenancy problems. So they are cess buildings. So there are many problems. But the point is, that whenever they get restored or whenever they get demolished and rebuilt, they have to be within the fabric height. They have to be within the form. The setbacks don't apply so that you won't disrupt the urban form. That's what the legislation did. Because otherwise, if money is suddenly unleashed, and we were particularly worried in
they will destroy everything. They will destroy everything.
Everything, exactly. So let me just say two quick things which would be of interest to people. We got worried about this in 92, 93, just when India started liberalizing its economy and people started talking about global capital coming in. So we realized that this was going to destroy the fort area. So that is what spurred us on, right? The reason we were successful, and this is the real secret, that we didn't get opposition from the Shiv Sena, which was a government in power at that time, or even the developers lobby, was because if you think about it, any building in the fort area is usually 3 or 4 floors high, and it has no setback. So it consumes 4 FAR or FSI, right?
Yeah.
If you demolished it, you would not be able to build more than 1.33. So it's a disincentive for anyone to demolish it. But before the FSI was increased, we said we should put the legislation into place. So that was the thinking.
No, excellent. And I'll tell you, if you ever come to Puerto Rico and San Juan, we have a whole old city at the time built in 550 years ago, old city. In San Juan also, we have created similar kind of guidelines and the legislation so that nobody can destroy it. And so I thank you so much for you and all the people who are involved in this, for preserving it.
Yeah, it's a big group now, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Kirti.
Well, first, was nice to see Kamar and Jayashree after almost, I don't know, 40 years, 45 years. So, and I don't know whether you are at in Ahmedabad or you are in New Jersey, but regardless, it's nice to see you, and probably next time you come here, we'd like to get you to.
We are here. Next time. We are here at the time, at this moment.
Okay. So we'll host you a special reception for your sake.
Oh my God.
You are, as Rahul says, you are his first kind of boss. So I think I had a great lot of memory of us. So we'll do that.
From my side, the story goes that he was my first employee and I was his first employer. And that's fantastic to see him again. And then he came back after his studies, and the project he had worked on was already built. And we went together to see that project, and he couldn't believe it that he had made the drawings for. And I remember that part also. Thank you, Rahul, for remembering me, and especially for remembering Sagra and his 12 paintings, actually.
Yes, no, I know.
He had made 10 or 12?
10 or 12 paintings he made
10
for us.
paintings.
And if you want to hear a small story behind it, is that students needed 10,000 rupees for some activity. And Sagra said, okay, I'll make 10 paintings if somebody is ready to give that money. I jumped onto the opportunity and I got 10,000. 10 paintings for 10,000 rupees. Big
Oh
amount.
my goodness, that's a bargain.
But big, the size,
Big size,
I
big
decided the
size.
size. I decided everything except the painting on that.
Yeah. And the biggest one was for the landing of your staircase.
Yes, yes, yes. And then, well, anyway, it's I get very emotional about those paintings because only few have survived.
Yes.
Okay, please. This is Rahul.
But on other, I think Rahul, it was wonderful, wonderful talk, and I feel like we are so blessed with all the CEPT alumni in a different areas and a field, and it's a really pleasure. So after the COVID is gone, we will have a actually live program in New York. So
we should nominate Avni to organize a CEPT conference. She'll be the best to do it.
Sure.
Rahul, I just want to say one thing. Rahul, listening to you, I was impressed by your humbleness, your transparency, and honest presentation, because you also said you celebrated the failure in the book, which is unusual and very, very polite and very nice way of putting it. I thank you so much.
Last things I have, Rahul, is that I'm going to buy your book on Amazon, but I wanted to have a signed by you. So I don't know, how does that work?
That's when we'll do that in New York, no?
New York? Okay, good.
That's the unfortunate thing with this pandemic. One would have otherwise, done this so much more easily or even sent you things, but it's just been impossible to get things around. But yeah.
Yeah.
Kirit bhai, I thought you were going to ask for the discount code.
Well, no, not from the CEPT.
No, that was just a joke.
I know.
Sharad, you have a nice collection of books in your background.
Well, I was like, I have to come up with some fake books in the back.
Okay.
All right. We still have a few more questions. All right. I think next question is from Param. Param, would you like to ask your question?
This was a thought actually came since last couple of years. Some machine language and artificial intelligence is going on like anything. And I really wanted to see, your thought process on how it is going to change the landscape of the design industry. It's, to me, if I predict this, I see that probably we have 10 years in hand, and probably we probably don't need any engineer, architect, lawyers, all those kind of people are gone pretty much. I really want to see your thought process on that. Do you think that is going to happen and the landscape is changing? Are we going to kill the creativity of the people?
Param, it would be pretentious if I tried to share any thoughts. This is not something I honestly have not thought about.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, the only thing I would say is that, design will exist. It might take on different forms or contributions, and its form might change. The act of synthesis and synthesizing, and that's what design offers us as a training, and we'll find ways to do that. What the iPhone has done, or what not iPhone, but cellular technology, it's created new kinds of relationships. But you can't say relationships have gone or been stronger. Maybe we're more in touch, but doesn't mean we are more intimate. So I think it's a matter of changing relationships and proportions. But I honestly, I don't want to hesitate and answer because I won't be able to articulate. I haven't really thought this through. So sorry about that.
No, you're perfectly all right. Thank you.
Thank you both. Next question is from Timir. Timir, you are on mute.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, my question was quite in line with what Parth Bhavsar had asked, but I would like to ask it a bit differently. Wanted to know about, your most memorable experience or some kind of experience that you would like to share with us through your career journey in the US.
In the US?
Yes.
Oh, gosh. Oh, I don't. Well, somebody else ask a question. If something comes to mind, I'll bring him. Sorry, there's nothing.
Or in terms of challenges or how it differed in terms of your experience in India and then when you came here, what kind of challenges you had to go through?
I mean, the thing is, I did move my practice here, no? So I think from the practice perspective, I don't know because I didn't do that. I mean, the challenges were all the challenges all of us have faced. In my case, I was coming here when I was a little older, meaning I had studied here, but I was moving a family here when I was, already close to 40. So, it's just setting up and, just setting up and into the system was a challenge. I've actually, and I say this carefully, I've actually gone back every 6 or 8 weeks for the last 16 years. Since February, I've been in the US. This is the longest I've been here since I was a student. And this is the second time in my life I've missed a monsoon or the mango season. So for me, I don't know, it's a bit, as I said to people, now, of course, these 9 months being here is making me think about things completely differently. But for over the 16 years, and I say this really with conviction and honesty, every time I got onto a plane in the US to go to India, I would thank God, I would sincerely thank God I was leaving America and going to India, and I would reach India and I would literally kiss the ground there, being so grateful I was back in India. But then 4 or 5 weeks later, when I was leaving India, I would be doing the opposite, thanking God I'm getting out of India, I'd had enough, and kissing the ground when I reached here, saying I was blessed that I had the opportunity to get away. And this went on in oscillation for 16 years. So, it's, I mean, I suppose we are all blessed that we have these opportunities, and, you can make the most of it. They get disrupted as they have now. And these are moments where you think about it, in terms of how you want to engage with it in the future. But yeah, so in a way, I think for me, in all transparency, I think if I was also practicing here, it would be a different thing. But my working has been so divided in the sense, in India, it's all practice. I don't teach there. I try even not to do lectures there. I do lectures there sometimes on request from colleagues and friends. But I'm really engrossed there at site. I'm, traveling and And then I come here and it's teaching, and it gives me an opportunity to reflect on, what I'm doing there. And partly this book is exactly about that. And, and so one just feels blessed that one has that opportunity. But also as a result of that opportunity, I think the kinds of observations you might be seeking in your questions, maybe I've not experienced because I have not tried to set up a practice here, or not, and in the university, you're fairly insulated because, you're teaching and, yeah. So sorry if I can't be more dramatic about answering that.
No, I think you answered it quite well, because generally people like us, for an example, I came on the student's route. I came here as a student. I had a different way of coming to US and settling here. Some people come with their families. You had a bit different route. That you came here with your association with the universities directly and got into the teaching. So
I often have, especially Indian students, I have Indian students who, after they graduate, they set up an appointment and they come to meet me, and then they ask me this question. They say that we'd like to do what you're doing. Please tell us how we can work in India and we can live here. And I say to them that, look, why don't you leave next month and go and work in India for 10 years and then come back? They never come to meet me again. So there is no magic formula. I just happened to do it the other way. I did it in opposite. And what was very interesting, and I'll say this as a very personal story, when I decided, after being in America for 2-3 years, when I studied, when I announced to my close circle of friends who were largely from Bombay and who were largely in information technology, And that is, I'm talking about 88, when Route 128, Silicon Valley hadn't even yet happened. It was all beginning to take off. They were shocked, and they were, I mean, they were taking me out individually for dinner, offering me loans to buy a car. Is that what you need? Do you need, I mean, they just, I mean, in a very nice way, because they just couldn't see the logic in going back to India. And, and I'm not exaggerating, and this is very interesting, that when I decided in 2003 and between 2003 and 2007 to spend time here, those same friends were all now like saying, my God, you're coming from India. India's booming. This is when our economy was booming, and, everyone was building a mall. Everyone and his uncle were building a mall, and, all that kind of, and a lot of my friends actually in the information technology sector moved back to India, to Pune, to Bangalore. Of course, they all came running back in 2-3 years, but they actually moved back because they felt, so we were kind of, ships passing in the night in a sense. And so it also depends on, which profession you're in, and, all that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next question is Hemin Modi.
Good evening, sir. As Chandni said, we are so privileged. First of all, thank you so much for an amazing discussion. I'm from Interior Design 92 batch, and I'm super fan of your work, by the way. In 92 thesis, I'm from the second batch of interior design. So there were not many practicing interior designer. Of course, there were none. So all the architects who would do the practice as an interior designer. And my thesis was on light and space, and I was focusing on a merchandising area. And I was having so hard time to find a good space where I can case study. And then surprisingly, I came across Bandage. And it was so amazing to be part of the whole process. I studied Bandage and a store called Parcos, which was also on CG Road, which was amazing. So thank you so much for opening up the whole interior design lighting chapter, and I'm enjoying so much. So thank you for that. And my question simple is, it's such an incredible journey, and I've been reading about you also. So apart from design, teaching, traveling, as you said, and research, simple question, how do you keep yourself motivated spiritually, physically, other than design? So how does that work? Because I'm sure everyone, one of us, if you take the design out of us, I don't know how else we can live. So.
Well, God, that's too heavy a question. So no, but I just, as you're talking about interior design, I just want to say something which I think would be interesting for everyone. It's, I mean, in big cities, we all start our careers through interiors, right? And that's why I dedicated a whole section in this book called The Architecture of the Interior. And, when I started my practice, we were lucky we got 1 or 2 houses to do, but it was largely interiors that were coming my way. And I remember talking to Anant Rajay, who by then had become a mentor. I did my thesis with him. I did my final year studio with him, and he would, and I'm sure a lot of you knew Anant Rajay. And he agreed to do my thesis because it meant he had to come to Bombay, which he loved. And so every time he came to Bombay, I would drive him all over the place, and we would go visit sites. I was doing my thesis on buildings in Bombay. And so, of course, when I met him, when I started my practice, his advice was, he said, in interiors, what we must do is we must confront the architecture. And once we confront the architecture, then we move away from decoration to design, And that was such an important clue that all the projects we did finally, even those interiors, however small they were, whether it was a restaurant or it was Bandage, it was about how do you confront it on architectural terms, which was, I think, what made the shift. And that's something I always remember Rajay for. So even in Bandage, it was a basement. And I said, my God, what can you do architecturally in a basement? And what we did was we said, let the structure disappear, that when you come into the basement, if you don't expect that heavy structure, what would it be? And that, so, it was always about trying to see how architecturally one could modulate it. And I think that was very, very interesting. I mean, your main question, I don't know how to answer. I suppose what they say, in life, finally, figure out what you enjoy doing and then get someone to pay you to do that. And so, I suppose as long as that gets taken care of and you enjoy it, you should make your decisions based on that. And that's always not easy always, but I don't know how else to answer your question. I think for me, maybe if I try to push myself to answer your question, I think it's just being able to do the different things that I think for me it's been important. And I think, of course, clearly for me, the choice was, in 2003, whether to grow the practice and make it a big office, or to combine it with teaching. I was at that crossroad, right? Because India was booming. We had just liberalized our economy. All this global capital was arriving. People were getting bigger projects. And the choice was, to just not to teach and stay back and I have a bigger office, or to teach and keep the office small and do a few things. Finally, one made that choice. And, and at that point, I remember I was very confused. I had this offer to come and teach more permanently at Michigan, and the office was doing very well. And at that time, we got there were two things that helped me make the decision. Now, this is again on a very personal note. One was, the same month as I got my letter from Michigan to come and teach there, I got the biggest project that we had ever got, which was to do a campus for Hewlett-Packard in Bangalore, same month. And I called the client, a man called Som Mittal, who went on to, I think, do other NASCOM. He became head of NASCOM, and he was head of digital in India. That time it was DEC Digital, before it became Hewlett-Packard. And I said, look, Som, he gave me this job. It's very interesting. He gave me this job because he came to a lecture. I never knew him. He heard a lecture and he called me after the lecture and said, could you meet me? I have a project and I think we could work together. So I met him and he gave us this project, and I went back to Bombay, and a week later I got this letter from Michigan. And this was the biggest dilemma of my life. And that was the crossroad, right? And so I went to meet him and I said, I can't take this job. I'm sorry, because I might be going to study, but I'm not sure. So he said, what do you mean going to study where? Are you going to Mars or Moon, or where are you going? So I said, no, I'm going to Michigan. So he said, let me tell you, you probably don't know, the world has changed a lot. He said, I deal with about 100 people around the world who I've never met in person ever, And at that point, one wasn't even using email, it was all just happening. I'm talking about actually 2002 or so. And, we were not using email as much. I mean, some people were, but it wasn't so much part of our lives, where if someone doesn't respond in 1 hour to your email, you get worried that they're upset with you. So he said, this is a virtual world and I'm happy for you to be in Michigan. Can you connect with me every week? Can you talk to me on the phone? I said, yes. But even that didn't convince me. And I came back to Bombay, and someone else had been working with, who had set up Pukar. I think Avni might know them, others might know them, Arjun Apudarai and Carol Breckenridge. And, we were having dinner together and I said, guys, I'm so confused. I don't know what to do. And, Arjun Apudarai, who's a well-known academic, he said to me, I thought he'd give me some really fundamental advice about how to juggle academics. And he said to me, Rahul, the Chinese have a saying, when you come to a crossroad, keep going. And so, finally, you follow your heart in a sense. And so, I don't know, one day I just got up in the morning and we decided, let's go and teach, So sometimes all I'm saying is that these are, it would be actually a falsification if one over-rationalize these things, One can try to explain them in the context of conversations or advice you hear, but finally we all synthesize that advice and, what's going on in our inner lives at that time. And so to go to your question of the spiritual, I think it guides you in some way, but it's also at some level very pragmatic, no? At some point you think, sometimes I think going back to Jinraj's sort of question, at that point I was fed up in Mumbai. I was in something like 12 government committees. I can't tell you, every Saturday, Sunday, all I was doing was committee work. I was fed up. So sometimes I think I made the decision to go to Michigan because I was so fed up with my weekends not being my own. So it might be a practical reason like that, or it might be something deeper and spiritual. Very hard to be objective about this.
So interesting. Yeah, I mean, I get so many clues, when you're telling me that. I think the combination of this teaching and practicing, I think it's such a fascinating stuff and so satisfying. Yeah. And especially if you can do it in 2 continents, it's even more amazing. So thank you so much for the insight.
Thanks. I'm often asked the question, how do you manage? And I say that when you use the word manage, there's an assumption that I am managing. So it's also a bit messy, meaning it's not, it's maybe I'm making it sound easy, but, it's fraught with all sorts of dilemmas and challenges and, which is the subject of another conversation.
I mean, I might add that when I worked with Page office back in 80s, and he always says, what is really critical for making decision, whether you have a fun or not doing what you're doing it. Yeah. And at any point when you are just dragging doing things, that's a time to change. That's a crossroad.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say, and I say this half jokingly, half seriously, even today we are doing very small projects. So we are doing a mixed bag. We recently did a small staircase for someone's apartment. I've come to the point where when I meet a client, I spend some time talking with them. And then if I, at the end of the conversation, think I can spend an evening having a drink with them, I take on the job. If I feel I can't do that, I don't take the job. So it's almost like a guiding principle now.
Interesting.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question is from Jigar Desai.
My God, this is really becoming
I know.
Nice conversation over chai. Yes, I've got my chai, so. Yes, Jigar.
Jigar Desai?
You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Professor Mehrotra, this is an awesome conversation, and this definitely needs more than one cup of chai. I can
but
tell
also,
you that.
I've been meaning to say this about 5 questions away. Please don't use the word professor. In this context, we were all colleagues and peers at CEPT. Let's leave that for the Rajas and the Doshis. Please use my first name. This is getting a bit like embarrassing.
That's very humble of you.
No, it's awkward.
So, okay. So my again, I asked my question before doing my research, but I'm going to share something quickly with you. One of my, I was in SBST in '96 and then went on to join CPM. So been in CEPT for almost 6.5 to 7 years. And one of the most fascinating things that I have found, like looking back at my experience there, is, working with the design professionals. And now I'm working with a lot of design professionals, hiring them, working with them. One of the most important things that I've learned in CEPT is the art of storytelling. I think that art, I think I can see that right now, the way you're articulating your reflections or your observations. I think that sets, most of the Septians apart from our competition. And doesn't matter how smart you are, but if you cannot sell your story or if you cannot sell your message, it's all kind of all a waste. So I think I thank CEPT for that, and I think I hope that even after the becoming a publicly funded college, that thing still stays and that culture still stays. I haven't been there for the last like 10 years, but I hope that DNA of CEPT still carries on. On my question, I think I asked my question before doing my research on the building performance side, that I see that CEPT already has a master's in building energy. I think my firm, we kind of do a lot of consulting, and that's becoming the trend. And I'm glad to see that CEPT has a master's in that program. However, I see that it's heavily geared on the technology side or on the engineering side, whereas like I'm practicing this, we are consulting, my firm is consulting, and we see architects playing a much bigger role on the building performance side, especially from not just the number crunching side on how are you going to get a net zero building or not, but on the constructability side. That doesn't matter, you can design it well, but if it is not constructed right, that's where I feel like there needs to be, and I don't know, and that's what my question is, that is the impetus on equally on the architects as well as the engineers for this program, or where are we going from as a institution, as CEPT?
You know, I have never taught there. I don't teach there, so I'm not sure. I mean, I've spent time there and so talked to people, but I don't feel equipped to answer your question because I really don't know firsthand. Clearly, I mean, what I can say, which might help this conversation or not, is CEPT has grown massively in the last, 5 or 10 years. And therefore, all the facilities and the programs have grown and things like that. And I think that has its own challenges in terms of scaling up, so to speak. And I know for a fact that they're facing those challenges. I mean, they've now invented a new foundational program where hopefully they'll bring some of these things together. But I really, really don't know how to answer that because I haven't been part of any conversations there, except my peripheral curiosity to ask them over conversations when I'm in other meetings. But I haven't engaged in any substantial way in their pedagogy or where they're going or how they're structuring it. So I honestly don't know.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Are we missing anybody? I do not see any more questions in the chat box, but if you please feel free to jump in if you still have any further questions.
Can I come in? This is Forum.
Sure.
Dr. Mehrotra, thank you so much.
I don't have a PhD. I'm not a doctor, so you better call me Rahul.
you said no for professor, so I had to do something.
No, Rahul is fine. Rahul is fine. I don't have a doctorate, no.
So Rahul, thank you for sharing your book, your experiences, your journey. It was really amazing. And I think you've got a great body of work. We saw that in the book, but I'm sure there is much more. You also talked about challenges that you faced in some of your projects, but I was wondering, what is your dream project? And if you were given a clean canvas tomorrow, let's say money is not a constraint, place is not a constraint, what would be your dream project?
Oh. You'd expect me to say CEPT library? No.
No, that was the precise reason I didn't.
Actually, my dream project would be a house that we could design for ourselves, which we not have the luxury in Bombay or elsewhere. And it would be a house that's as small as you can make it, potentially. Seriously, that would be my dream project. That's why it stays a dream, right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from anyone? All right, looks like.
I just had a question. I mean, Rahul, I mean, it's been amazing listening to you and sharing what you all just shared. I had a question regarding what's happening right now, the pandemic. Like it's been repeated for the last 3 centuries. How do you see this shaping our future, where the virtual is real and the real is virtual now?
Well, I mean, look, if I could predict that, I would be like everywhere. No, but I mean, I think what's going to happen. I mean, these are moments in time and history, with shifts where an event, I mean, I remember as a student reading Octavio Paz, who was the Mexican ambassador to India, who was also a poet. And he wrote a book called, I think it was called One Earth and Many Worlds or something like that. I can't remember the title, where he talked about these long and short counts in history. And he said, short counts are counts that seem unique at the moment, but are actually repetitive in the long durée. So for example, the pulling down of the fort walls in Bombay or the pulling down of the fort walls in Vienna when cities were expanded in the 1850s and 60s seemed like major events, right? But they were repetitive, happening all over the globe, and they were merely small tweaks in technology, really, correct? But he said the big counts were big shifts that occurred where, entire nations or entire continents or parts of the planet were affected. So he talked, and they also cause kind of fundamental shifts in mindset, no? So he said, for example, certain kinds of technologies, like, I think with information technology, that's created a completely different shift. He even argued that big shifts of demography, which is what is happening with migration and refugees, could create complete mixes in certain societies, which create major mind shifts, right? And I believe the pandemic is one that is going to create, it's going to complete the project of the information technology shift, because we are all embracing conversations like this so easily. And what will become acceptable for the virtual and what will be acceptable for the real will change. I mean, I remember when I was a student, when information technology was being introduced, people were saying Wall Street will be redundant once there's communication technology, and that proved to be completely wrong, because face-to-face contact proved to be even stronger for deals than the virtual, right? So some things that we are seeing right now as having a lot of wings will actually diminish, but I think there will be residues of this which will allow a completely different relationality between how we see the home and the world, how we see our localities, and how that locality is situated in the world. What form they'll take, I don't know. Right now, what is happening is, there's so much being convened, because the power to convene by the virtual is enormous. No, I mean, I saw a beautiful cartoon which had, a skeleton sitting by a laptop, and it said "Death by Webinar." Because everyone and his cousin are having a webinar now, and when you go to many webinars, it just becomes a forum for people to talk who are not equipped to even be given that dais. And someone said, what is happening on webinars today is what formerly happened in bars. People went and they expressed their opinions, and then you went home and you were free of it. Now you're not free of it because it's recorded, because it's on Instagram. So you're subject to everyone's opinions. So some of that will go away. And I think we'll become more cultured about it in the way we use these technologies. And there'll be a culture that will, I think, develop around it. No, right now, for example, I can't avoid any meetings because all the excuses I had, I was on a plane, I was traveling, I was driving to school, have all gone, so my days have become twice the length because I have run out of excuses. There'll be a culture that will develop around it, and there'll be a culture that will develop how we convene. Sorry, I'm going on and on because I'm really not clear what the effects will be. But if I had to just give you 2 sentences of my own take, I think we'll move into a kind of hybrid set of relationships, even in our dealings, in our teaching, in our practice, in our profession, because we'll realize many things can be sorted out. There'll be one more moment on the spectrum. So, earlier it was email and face-to-face. And I remember I was talking earlier about the problems of practicing like this. There would be sometimes a contentious issue on a project, which would become 150 emails long. Then I would go to Bombay and have a cup of coffee with the client, and it would disappear face to face, right? Now we'll also have an in-between point, because I think the virtual at least allows us to see each other face to face, not totally see the body language, but at least understand it. So I think that spectrum will widen a little bit, which means other kinds of opportunities will exist. I can see many lectures and conferences happening virtually. I can see many conferences happening hybrid, which means some people are in the room, some people are virtual. It's what sci-fi had shown us many years ago. And I think that'll kind of become real in our dealings. What happens to the economy, what happens to politics, I'm not equipped to speculate about. I'm sorry, I'm not clear because not something one has really thought through.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great insight to it. Yeah, I mean, it's changing. Like a lot of companies like Facebook, they said, or Microsoft, they're saying that you don't need to come back to work, and people have started moving from California to Texas and other states. So it's changing the way we work. I mean, I don't think I need to go back to office. I mean, I have a setup now where I travel and come back home rather to go in a building. So
But
I guess,
Deepak, we'll also see the limits of that. No, it's too
yes.
early to see what the limits are. I mean, I'm beginning to feel the limits on many aspects of my teaching, which went well initially, but now I'm beginning to think, my God, if I had only had 3 more sessions sitting there with that person, helping them draw something, it would be completely different. So we'll see the limits more clearly with time. It's too early to see the limits, I think.
Thank you.
And I see ultimately what will happen, that this is a phase which will come over, because ultimately we need a physical contact. We cannot avoid that. The repercussions of these are so many. The psychological problems are going to grow, and we are witnessing them right now. So this is a phase we are going, we'll adopt it, we'll change it, but ultimately we will meet.
Thank you. Thank you for a great conversation. Do we still have anybody else who would like to ask a question?
Well, I'll just pipe in, not with a question, but partly just to say hello to Rahul, irrespective of all the text messages. But to extend, all this conversation about the pandemic, and one has been finding that there's a lot of, there's new understanding that sort of the old Western world, not the old Western world, but the developed world has a lot to learn from other parts of the world. And I think with this book of yours, looking at its visuals, the fact that you've practiced here, we haven't seen the text, but I'm hoping very much that there's that kind of trade of learning in terms of people looking at the book here and learning from it too.
Thanks. No, Avni, I think part of the motivation was also really that is that, how can one, and I know this is something that's been of interest to you for a long time, and you've had many forums that you've supported and facilitated around this. I'm coming to this conversation maybe 2 decades after you did, but really how one can frame the problems from another perspective, outside the hegemony, in a sense of the Western framework. And so part of the voice in the book also, one has written it in the first person with the hope that, not only is it situated in experiences, but hopefully coming from another perspective. But I might not be aware of my own implicit biases having studied here in the US, but let's say it's a start, and be interesting to, after people like you have read it, to have a conversation around that.
Well, I saw your earlier book, which had the classification of the different types of architectures. So I think you've been doing this kind of work of seeing what's local, what's hybrid, what's modern, what are the different types of technologies, forms, etc. So,
and in fact, that book, I'm glad you referred to it, because this book opens with the experience of that book. And that book was called Architecture in India since 1990 for 2 reasons. One is our liberalization occurred then with the new economy, but also I started our practice at that time. And there, the premise, I think, as Avni was alluding to, was really, if you remove the lens of modernism, what do you see on the Indian landscape? And things that we otherwise filtered out because we were only looking at through the lens of modernism. Therefore, we were celebrating, and rightly so, whether it was Doshi's work, Charles Correa's work, Raj Rival's work, that first generation of architects, we were celebrating. And this is not to undermine their contribution, but we were limiting our celebration, or not even celebration, we were limiting our recognition of architecture through the way modernism was extended in the locality. So, but the lens was a modernist lens. And so that book was about removing that lens and seeing other things, not to legitimize other things, but just to bring the awareness that, look, there were bigger projects happening which don't even include architects because they use ancient images and they are not part of the legacy of modernism. So this book actually has been designed in size and volume and format exactly as that book. And that book, we left out all our work because we didn't, one was wearing the hat of a critic. And so one is actually, Avni, I'm glad you referred to it, one has used the same format as that book, but reflected upon our practice.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. And it's been a great event because you don't know whether you're in Ahmedabad or whether you're in New York. I mean, you just can't tell. It's just so natural. So thank you to the organizers.
Yeah. Please do more of these.
Yes, we will. This is the first one that we started, so more to come. Do we have anyone else who would like to have a question, jump in, just say hello, have a conversation?
And Kirti will keep reminding you about New York, the rendezvous in New York.
Of course, we'll have to do it.
All right.
Rahul, I think that initially when you just started, right? I mean, in this forum today, you asked this question that's got me thinking since the time you said this. Does permanence matter? Right. That is quite a fascinating thing to ponder upon. I think about Burning Man, where people come together for 9 days, build things together, celebrate a culture together, and then they go, right? And there are people, young people these days that are thinking about, I don't want to be associated with just one place. That's my permanent home. I want to experience different things. So it's quite a fascinating question. I don't know. I just wanted to share that. You got me thinking on a different note there.
But if you, I mean, for whatever it's worth, if you just Google my name and TED Talks, it's a 12-minute talk on this, and you'll enjoy it if you're asking these questions. Because I touch upon Burning Man, I touch upon all of this.
Oh, really? Okay.
So just Google. It was last year in Vancouver, maybe a year and a half ago. So it's 12 minutes, very short, but it'll answer your question in some ways.
Yeah, no, it just got me. I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that, because it just got me thinking about some things. So I'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else?
I have just a question and comment to Rahul. Is that I think what you touched up at the end is a very, very been sort of thinking for last 30 years is the first generation of architects always looked it through the Western lens to solve the Indian problem. And I think now there is quite a body of work being created. And is there anybody documenting that sort of a change in a trend, the kind of quantifying the or the kind of the whole new process that is a really worth celebrating? I know your book is kind of tells something about
the architecture in India since 1990 tried to do that. And now I think there are many architects who are at least publishing their own work. So you're beginning to, see some of that. And I think the magazines in India are covering more of that kind of work. I mean, I think the most important book which started this question and trend, but yet was an extension of modernism, was Vikram Bhatt's book, which was After the Masters, where he at least opened up the discussion, which made us look at the first generation. And I think the first generation was very important because, yes, while they were, look, I mean, I think modernism was a kind of Nehru agenda which neutralized. I mean, the way I describe it is the agenda for the first 20 years stipulated by Nehru was we were trying to create a nation state. And so therefore it was all about an architect. It was all about Indian architecture, right? That means it was about architecture being used to define India. And I think that generation did an incredible job about creating this pan-Indian identity. But then from the 1980s, basically the emergency is when the disillusionment dawns. And at emergency, we realize that actually the optimism of independence and what we had hoped for diminished. And we recognized there was poverty, there was fracture, caste and religion were yet omnipresent in the informing of politics. And our politics after that became regionalist, right? Regionalist parties started emerging everywhere. And then we moved very quickly into coalition governments, right? So if you look at the political landscape, you can't avoid that in understanding the architectural landscape. And so therefore, things were being built regionally, which began to get a lot of significance at all ends of the spectrum, from Laurie Baker working with low-income people to big temples being built for Akshardham and other things, right? And so you got a bit fractured. So therefore, that's why I called the book Architecture in India, not Indian architecture, or not an so like Charles Courier's Vistara was called an architecture for India, or Raj Rival's, one of theirs, So it was yet for that first generation, it was the agenda, rightly so, was the construction of a pan-Indian identity. I think for our generation, the challenge becomes how you create a narrative outside architecture that perhaps creates this idea of India, which is, as we all know, in great threat right now. And so, I think our role and our instrumentality in that narrative, whoever talked about stories being a very important part of what they learned at CEPT and being important for this, becomes something that we really have to think about in how we position, architecture in this larger debate. So I think that's a very interesting question, one we can actually have a whole conversation about.
Hi, Rahul. This is Amit
Kirti,
Patel.
I think Kirti had some follow-up. So let him, sorry, Amit, yeah.
No, the question came when I was like, I think 96, there was a exhibition arranged in New York called Architecture of Independence.
Yes.
And and I was sort of involved in some of the kind of tertiary, how they're going to be doing it. And because it was a
Architectural League.
Architectural League was the one who kind of did it. And while I was sort of at some of the talk that Doshi gave, one Korea gave here to Asia Society, some of these, my American friend came in, he says, this thing looks like you are still having, the colonial mentality hasn't left India, and it's reflected in architecture after independence, which is continuum of the colonial legacy. And I kind of felt that particularly it didn't start it. It's sort of academia was still trying to fit into the Western kind of.
Totally.
Yeah, totally. And I think I still don't see a academia architectural are kind of clearing that directions or defining the direction. And maybe you are at the position that you probably can have something that people understand, or I guess you can articulate the sort of need for that.
No, I think that's it's a complicated question and an important one. And I think these sorts of discussions and many more and many other self-reflections like this will at least give us some way forward, and it'll take a while. And I think the first thing in this step is to accept a broader array of things, be more pluralistic about what we accept as being legitimate. That becomes a value judgment that locks us into the old path. And I don't know how, but Kirti, on a lighter note, that I came for that because they also did a conference to complement the exhibition called an Architecture of Independence and the next generation or something. And so I was that's the first time I used my passport. As I was saying, I hadn't used it for 10 years. So that was and I felt like Rip Van Winkle because I hadn't been part of these discussions. But I don't know the answer to your question, but it's a very important one.
May I say something? In SA50, when we celebrated, there were two phases. One was last 50 years and future 50 years. So for last 50 years, I wrote an article which is published in an essay publication. I called it Self-Inflicted Colonization of Indian Architecture. And in which my sentence was that when British left India, we forgot to ask them whether we should design Indian architecture in modern context or modern architecture in Indian context. And I think we followed the modern architecture in Indian context because we assumed that was the answer. It was a very critical essay, and if anybody is interested, I will share it with you.
Well, I'd be very interested.
It's in the book. It's in the book of the publication of CEPT. Yeah, I'll send it to you now.
So it was modern architecture in an Indian context or an Indian architecture.
In modern context.
Very good. Yeah. Send it to me too. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just looking at the same critical viewpoint that Rahul and you are talking about.
Yeah, no, it becomes a very important question. Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you. Amit, I think you had a question.
Sorry, Amit, we cut you out.
Yeah. No. That was very interesting conversation going, and I'm going to switch it a little bit for my selfish interest. I don't know if you remember me, but from UMass Boston in your neighborhood.
Yes.
And we met at Slum Symposium that you organized.
Yes.
And as a creator of institutions, I want to remind you that we discussed the possibility of doing that over and over again to keep the slum in the debate. So was wondering if there are any thoughts or things going on that that you're doing on this.
It's interesting you asked the question, because the last 2 months, 3 months during this, we have been trying to have a conversation of at least trying to put together what was discussed there and get that out as a connection to the next one. We haven't, I mean, the pandemic has disrupted things so much, but that's an ongoing conversation right now, because we felt just to get a PDF and get it out virtually as a book in digital form would be a good way, because then among whoever was there for the conference, someone else might pick it up and carry on the conversation. So let's keep in touch on that. Good prompt, you've reminded me. I'll write to them again.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for the conversation. Do we have anybody else?
No, we can go on like that.
Yeah, right. We also do not want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what might be nice, Neha? I mean, Kirti and Jinraj's questions and responses, you know, it might be nice. I mean, we could do this. I mean, maybe you can sometimes we could even just do a theme and get together and chat about the theme, no?
Yeah, that's a good idea too.
Yeah, whether it's artificial intelligence, some other people might have thought more about it and they could contribute, or Jinraj's question about modern architecture and, you know, Kirti's question, which is similar. Maybe we should set up some themes like this, and it could be, and maybe 1 or 2 people could be requested to kick off the conversation in a provocative way, and then we can have a conversation.
Yes, perfect. I mean, this is a great suggestion, and we will definitely work on those ideas.
Rahul, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all. I mean, this has just been super fun.
Thank you, Rahul Mehrotra, so much for, you know, we had initially planned the event for 1 hour, but, you know, it is like 2 hours, 15 minutes now.
Oh my gosh, I didn't realize.
I hope we have not exhausted you with the flood of questions.
No, we could have gone on. I mean, I thought Jinraj was now starting a conversation that would go on for another 1 hour.
Well, Neha, Rahul, Vatsal, I think thank you very much. I have to kind of sign off, and it's kind of a sap gene that we love to talk with each other and kind of have fun. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Yes.
Okay.
Look forward soon. Thanks. Happy holidays, everyone. Happy holidays.
If the debate started going on, we would have been here all night.
Thank you, Rahul Mehrotra. Let's have a big round of applause for Rahul Mehrotra. Thank you so much for answering all of the questions.
Yes.
For a great conversation. And
thank you, sir.
And we, before we conclude, we just have one, I would like to pass on to Vatsal. He just have a quick announcement for the next events. Vatsal, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Professor Mehrotra. That was really good. And I would just like to highlight simple couple of things and upcoming events. In January, we have an event in which Suresh Bhai, Amit, thank you for agreeing to join. And we will have others as well. We try to bring people from different disciplines, different schools at the same timeline. So we try to keep it quite diverse. And in the same fashion, recently, Neha, Timir, and Ganju suggested us starting with this concept as well. So we are just trying to dabble in different areas. And Rahul, that you suggested about having topical discussions would be a great way for us to get that discussion started as well, so that we can interest people in different ways and different directions. So with that, again, I just wanted to highlight that we would want to connect with people in different ways, so professional, social networks and all. and please join us for that. If at all you want to propose any speakers or you would want to speak or something, please let us know and reach out to us on our emails on this particular website. We have a page and link posted already, so please do that. And we were thinking to start the social. So whomsoever want to please continue being with us. We would now stop the recording, but also start some casual discussions as well. So thank you all for joining. Thanks, Rahul, for a very casual but very interesting, thought-provoking discussions. And we look forward to having more such discussions. I was so happy to have Kamar Uncle and Jayashree Auntie also join us. So it's a great pleasure for all of us being here. And again, as you all have been saying, it's a good way in which we all are just getting together, share our ideas. Go ahead.
What's amazing is the amount of years we are spanning in this group.
Of course.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Rahul, are you trying to say that we have become old?
I'm merely being objective. I'm just saying it's spanning many decades.